The hearing will come to order. Welcome to the Committee on the Budget hearing, which will focus on the economic and fiscal benefits of pro-growth policies. Good morning, and thank you everyone for being here. And I want to especially thank our great panel that's here with us today. Our witnesses are being willing to come in this morning and provide their thoughts on this important topic. We're having this hearing today in preparation for the upcoming release of our 2018 budget resolution. An important component of that resolution is an analysis of our economic conditions and our projections of future economic growth. Over the last 8 years, we have seen stagnant economic growth, leading economists and the CBO to consistently downgrade their growth projections. As recently as 2012, the CBO projected our economy would average a 3% growth over a 10-year window. This year, the CBO is only projecting an average of 1.9% growth over the next 10 years. However, it's important to point out that the CBO's projections are based on the assumption of continuing existing law with no changes in the economic policy. There is no question that the policies of the Obama years greatly contributed to the anemic economic growth and the downgraded growth projections. Higher taxes, the disaster that Obamacare, an expanded regulatory regime, and more federal spending and debt have held back the American entrepreneurs and small businesses. The Obama economy left millions of Americans behind. Over 14 million Americans left the labor workforce during the Obama administration's 8 years in office. That's 14 million Americans. And in total, 95 million Americans are now out of the labor force, 95 million. That's more than 1/3 the total working age population. And I think that's important to emphasize, that there are 95 million Americans that are now out of the labor workforce, more than 1/3 of the total working age population. It's been the working class Americans in the coal mines of West Virginia, or the factories of Central Tennessee, or the farming communities in Nebraska that have borne the brunt of the liberal agenda over the last 8 years. The ability and the opportunity to work is a fundamental pillar of the American dream. Without the stability and self-worth that comes from having a job and providing a better future for one's children, our culture and our economy are truly our national morale suffers. Plenty of our friends across the aisle and many in the media have said that a 1.9% growth is the new normal. They have a pessimistic view of our nation's ability to create jobs and build a foundation of greater opportunity for all citizens, especially if the new president and the Congress are successful in enacting a series of pro-growth policies. While I'm never surprised by the media's pessimism, I am surprised that our friends across the aisle have such a negative view of Congress's ability to affect real change and to set a new economic standard. So I've got a message for everyone here today who thinks America is doomed to a future of less opportunity and potential. Take your losing attitude elsewhere. We are the greatest country on earth. We've got the best workers, the best innovators, and the best companies, and they are not the problem. Washington, D.C. is the problem. Government is getting in their way, and it's about time that we fix that problem. And that's why the Republicans are committed to reforming the tax code, reforming our health care system by repealing and replacing Obamacare, by reducing the regulatory burden on American small businesses, and getting our fiscal house in order, which is our responsibility in this committee. These policies will spur economic growth and unleash potential of the American free market economy. We'd welcome our Democratic colleagues to join us in this effort, but it requires them to no longer be content with the status quo of the Obama years. We've got to put those years behind us, because there is no law that we have to forever accept President Obama's slow growth policies. We can make changes to improve our economy, and we can start with adopting a budget resolution that puts our country on a sound fiscal path. Growing our economy is also a vital step to getting our fiscal house in order. Since World War II, 3% growth has been actually the historical average. In the late 1990s, our economy grew by a rate of 4.5%, more than twice the rate of our growth today. It's no coincidence that we also balanced the federal budget during this time period. Strong economic growth combined with spending restraint is how we get our country on a path to balance and how we begin to pay down the national debt without raising taxes. I believe our economy is on the cusp of a great resurgence. The pro-growth policies of healthcare reform, tax reform, regulatory reform, and deficit reduction will provide the economic freedom and the certainty that our economy needs to grow, to create jobs and create the type of opportunity that is the birthright of all Americans. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on how we can develop better policies to boost our economy. And it's time for optimism and new ideas, not pessimism, and willingness to accept the status quo. And with that, I yield to my ranking member, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you very much, Chairman Black, and I thank the witnesses for being here. We look forward to hearing from you. Obviously, economic growth is a critically important issue. Increased economic growth can benefit American families and the federal budget outlook. But we can't have a meaningful hearing about economic growth without acknowledging the fact that the level of economic growth projected in the President's budget is totally unrealistic, if not absurd. Any budget that includes that level of growth should not be taken seriously. Americans deserve more than faith-based economics. We need to be honest with them. Despite all the wishful thinking of the administration and some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, long-term economic growth of 3% is just not going to happen, particularly given the current economic and labor trends we face. There are good reasons why CBO is projecting the economy's long-term growth rate is 1.9%, and why the blue chip consensus private sector forecast is only slightly better at 2.0%. The entry of the baby boom generation and increasing numbers of women into the workforce helped support economic growth in the 1970s and 1980s. Those demographic trends have ended and they are not going to return. But we can take steps to help strengthen our economy, and they are steps that the American people overwhelmingly support. We can raise the minimum wage. We can invest in state-of-the-art infrastructure, in innovation to create the next industries, research and science to make the next big discovery, and education and job training to develop a more skilled and productive workforce. We can end loopholes that allow companies to ship jobs and profits overseas. And we can enact comprehensive immigration reform to increase the size of our workforce and the size of our economy. Those are all things we can do now and should do now. Massive tax cuts are not the answer, even though we're likely to hear that claim a lot today. We've done that before, actually twice. Instead of sustained economic growth, our deficits exploded. Both of those tax cuts were accompanied by lax regulation that contributed to financial crises and recessions just a few years later. Regulatory reform is not a silver bullet either, but we will likely hear that today as well. Most regulations already must meet a cost-benefit test. Rescinding regulations without a very thorough understanding of the threat that rescission would cause to both direct economic benefits and non-economic benefits, such as improved health, safety, and environmental conditions, would be irresponsible. Presumably, this is our last hearing before the release of my Republican colleagues' budget. Economic growth will obviously be a big part of their proposal, and it is my hope that it will be far different than the President's budget, that it will use responsible economic growth projections, that it won't rely on debunked claims that massive tax cuts pay for themselves, that it will increase funding for national priorities that will grow our economy, and that it will make investments in our nation's greatest asset, the American people. We plan to talk about that and more today, and I hope to hear some helpful insights from our witnesses. I look forward to your testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth. And Dr. Holtz-Egan, Dr. Furman, and Dr. Diamond, thank you for being here today and taking time out of your schedule to join us. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be part of the formal record. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks.
Thank you.
Dr. Diamond, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Black, Ranking Member Yarmouth, and members of the committee. It's an honor to present my views on the benefits of economic growth. Growth is important in determining the future size of the economy and the standard of living. Small changes in growth can have a significant impact on the size of the economy. For example, increasing the growth rate from 2 to 2.5% would increase the size of the economy by 28% after only 10 years. Accordingly, policies that increase the growth rate of the economy by a small amount can have significant impacts in the long run. Enacting pro-growth policies is particularly important at this point in time for two reasons. First, the U.S. faces fiscal policy that is on an unsustainable path, with deficits and debts projected to continue to grow dramatically as the baby boom generation ages and transitions from work to retirement. Thus, this is going to decrease the ratio of workers to retirees while increasing public expenditures on retirement and healthcare programs. Second, there's substantial uncertainty regarding the future growth rate of the American economy. One view is that continued innovation will spur productivity growth in the coming decades as new technologies lead to significant increases in output per person. However, another view is that the recent advances in technology have not led to significant and lasting increases in productivity, and that in addition, the U.S. economy is facing a number of impediments that may reduce the real growth rate of real GDP per person, such as large federal budget deficits and budget deficits on the state and local level, demographic changes such as an aging population, the growth and accumulation of regulatory policy, and slower gains in educational and achievement. In addition, rising inequality, changes in family structure and other social indicators, as well as the effects of globalization, including increased competition from abroad, may also dampen future growth rates. The most apparent impediment is the current path of U.S. fiscal policy, which is unsustainable. CBO projects that total spending will increase as a share of GDP from 20.7% in 2017 to 29.3% in 2047. Total revenues already projected to increase from 17.8% to 19.6% of GDP over that period. Deficits are projected to increase from 77% to 150%. As noted, demographic changes are driving much of that increase, with the remaining increase related to rising interest payments on the national debt. The obvious conclusion is that projected expenditure increases in the United States are unsustainable, and fiscal restraint is imperative. The United States must reduce its projected level of expenditures and reform its tax system to reduce economic distortions and maximize economic growth. Tax reform should include a focus on limiting government expenditures that occur through the tax system. Otherwise, the combination of a rising debt and a relatively distortionary tax system will significantly hamper economic growth. Demographic changes will also reduce economic growth in the future because the retirement of the baby boom generation will further reduce the labor force participation rate. Another important impediment is the accumulation of government regulations. Excessive regulation of the U.S. economy is likely slowing growth and limiting risk-taking behavior. Mulligan in 2015 argues that the Affordable Care Act will reduce employment and hours worked by 3% and labor income and GDP by 2%. Dawson and Cedar 2013 find that regulation added since 1949 is responsible for decreasing the size of the U.S. economy by 28% as of 2005. They argue that their results explain much of the decline in productivity since the 1970s. Obviously, major reform of regulatory law is long overdue. The slowing growth in educational attainment is also likely to impede economic growth in the future relative to the past 50 years, and we should be active on that front as well. Policymakers should focus on reducing the government debt through spending restraint, reforming and reducing entitlement programs, reprioritizing other expenditure items to fit within a sustainable budget, and minimizing marginal tax rates while reforming expenditures that occur through the tax system. Thank you.
Dr. Diamond, I want to ask you about, there seems to be a discrepancy between the current low unemployment rate of 4.3% and a quite lackluster economic output. And you mentioned some of those factors in your opening comments. Is one of the factors causing the fact that we have 14 million people that have left the workforce since 2009? Is that impacting it? And if we could enact policies that would encourage some of these people to get back into the workforce, thereby increasing that labor supply, would that help to boost the growth potential as well, just getting these people back into the marketplace of productivity?
Absolutely. I think that if you look at what's happened with labor force participation rate, the articles I read tend to imply that about half of the reduction has been because of aging of the population. The other half is because people are leaving the workforce voluntarily, and this is largely because we have implemented policies that are in effect implicit taxes on work. And so the Affordable Care Act is basically a very large implicit tax on working, and so people are choosing to not work as much. And if we could instead implement policies that promote work instead of discourage it, I think that would offset at least a large part of the labor force participation reduction that's not due to the aging of the population.
You mentioned the Obamacare in particular and the ruling on the 30 hours, and employers, I know I've heard throughout my district about those that were working part-time that maybe occasionally would go over the 30 hours. Now they were getting less than that, which meant they had to have 2 jobs, which is very difficult, especially on families. So that's one of the policies. Do you have other thoughts on other policies that we might be able to put into place to encourage these 14 million people to get back in the workforce? Because I know when we hear that there's a 4.3% unemployment rate, people think, oh, everybody's working. And if we did have a time where we did have everybody working, we saw more productivity, we actually saw more economic growth. But the true number on that is not the unemployment rate. It is the workforce participation rate, where we have 14 million people out of the workforce, literally almost a third of those who should be working. Fixing the healthcare piece is one of those, but do you have other ideas of some of the policies that we might need to fix in order to bring people back into the workforce?
Yes, 2 other policies that would be important I think most important would be regulatory reform. It's amazing that one of the benefits of innovation is it's a lot easier to reach people and to start businesses. The problem is, from a regulatory perspective, it's become a lot harder to start businesses, and so we need regulatory reform to allow people to create businesses and create products that consumers want. I think that would be helpful. We also need tax reform. The tax system is complex and very distortionary. I think if we could simplify the system while maintaining the revenue needed to fund expenditures, that would have a positive benefit on people getting back to work.
Okay, thank you. My final question is, we can just go right across, and if we can start with you, Dr. Holtz-Egan, that we have now got this new normal of 2% GDP. We think that's the new normal. Yet, if we look at history, we see that 3% really has been the average over a long period of time up until the last several years. And so, in other words, that's really an aberration. It's not really a trend. With the correct pro-growth policies in place, do you think that we can achieve those higher growth rates in future years, other than just saying we're going to just say 2% is the normal and that's what we can expect? How much higher also do you think that we could reasonably go if we were to put these reforms that have already been talked about in place? So I don't leave you all very much time, but let's start with Dr. Holtz-Egan. Dr. Diamond?
I think a percentage point, as Dr. Holtz-Egan predicts, is possible. I agree with Dr. Furman's point as well, though. I think what that would require is immigration reform that really focuses on bringing more high-skilled people to the U.S., not low-skilled people. Without that, I would say maybe around 2.6%.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your input on that. My own feeling that I'm just going to insert here is that we need to get the 14 million people that are sitting wherever, whether it's in their parents' homes or whether they're just out of the workplace because they can't find a job. I think education is a piece of that, and getting skilled workers, because one of the things I hear in my district, especially with my manufacturers, is that if we had more skills at that level, not necessarily four-year degrees, but more the technical degrees, that we could actually be putting people into those very good jobs that are well-paying jobs. And so I think the educational piece and maybe shifting our focus from four-year degrees to something that is more what the marketplace is needing in the job market might help us also to bring people back into the workforce. So thank you. I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member.
Thank you, Chairman Black.
Excuse me, 10 minutes.
Thank you
I
very
apologize.
much.
I cut you by 5.
I wasn't going to stop, don't worry.
And you should not. So now your time starts.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for your testimony and your responses. First of all, I'd like to just make a couple comments regarding Chairman Black's opening, because I know it's nice to forget about the condition that the economy was in when President Obama took office, and the chairman wants to blame all of this, what she would call lower growth rate, on President Obama's policies. But as you recall, when he took office in January of 2009, we were running a $1.4 trillion annual deficit. We had lost, the month he took office, 800,000 jobs. That was the trend at that point. We had the worst economic downturn since the 1930s, and we had a significant financial crisis that threatened to tank the economy. And as we got our feet on the ground, as coming out of that very, very precarious situation, we've had now 70-something consecutive months of job growth. And while the percentage of growth would not be what we all would want, certainly I think that any objective look at the Obama administration's economic performance would be a positive one. But I want to return to this notion about historic rates of growth. And we had Director Mulvaney here a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of my Republican colleagues talked about the growth after World War II and the growth rate leading up to current times, and the average of the growth of over basically 60 or 70 years. And I think you can infer from all of your testimony that the world is very different now than it was following World War II. Demographics, certainly the number one difference. We didn't talk about life expectancy. It's not just that many people are retiring, it's that they're living a lot longer, and therefore Social Security is paid out a lot longer, and medical care as well. The income disparity was mentioned, technology was mentioned, and its effect on automation. So would all of you concede that talking about the growth rate in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s is pretty much irrelevant to dealing with the world we're in now? What possible relevance could post-World War II growth rates have to what we're facing now? Does anybody want to make the case that it is relevant? Okay, nobody does. Thank you. Well, no, we had that a number of times brought up again with Director Mulvaney. So another factor I would think is that the sheer size of the United States economy also makes historic growth rates more difficult. Is it not fundamentally true, and we're seeing it in China as well, that as economies age and grow, that getting a growth rate as high as you've had in the past is just mathematically more difficult? Isn't that not a factor as well? Tax reform has been mentioned as a possible way to stimulate economic growth, both by Dr. Holtz-Eakin and certainly by Dr. Diamond. Would you two give me your sense of what comprehensive tax reform would look like in your ideal version of the best way to promote economic growth through tax reform? Dr. Diamond, would you like to respond to that?
I agree with Doug that the blueprint has some very good qualities to it. And I would also offer up proposals under President Bush's advisory panel on tax reform, as well as the proposal put forth by the Fiscal Commission created under President Obama. I think really we've had a lot of good examples of decent tax policy put forward over the last 2 decades. Unfortunately, none of them have been enacted.
Would you say that a consideration of economic disparity is important in any discussion of tax reform, since we now have some of the greatest economic disparity in this country in our history?
I think any tax reform should be looked at in terms of its efficiency, its simplicity, how administrable it is, as well as how fair it is. And the fairness question is ultimately a decision that is left in your hands.
Thank you. Just a final comment. This relates to Chairman Black's opening comments when she said Congress, we shouldn't be surprised if the Congress can't take on these tasks. I think it's the evidence is there that Congress is not particularly capable right now of taking on very many difficult tasks. So I would like to think that we were capable of it, but I haven't seen much evidence. So thank you again for your responses, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and now I would like to recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Verkita, the Vice Chair of the committee.
Dr. Diamond, do you have anything to add to the conversation we just had? If not, I have some questions for you.
I agree with Dr. Holtz-Egan's points. I did see in the news yesterday there was an article about 13 counties in Alabama that had implemented work requirements to get SNAP benefits, and SNAP benefits fell by, I can't remember if it was 50% or 85%, but immediately it made me think that, that maybe some more pro-growth safety net policies are needed.
Thank you. Dr. Furman, I'm out of time. I apologize.
The gentleman's time has expired, and I just want to add here that we talk about this as a productivity for our nation, but I think even more important to that is dignity. There is a dignity to work, and I think we lose that here in our country when we don't recognize and uphold that. I often say to people that a second question you ask them after you ask them their name is, what do you do? And if we can't say what we do, we lose a dignity, and I think that's a stronger net than the safety net, is that net within our country of dignity. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It was mentioned by the previous speaker, who I greatly respect, that if we on this side of the aisle just stop obstructing, we could get things done. I've heard a lot of things during my 4+ years here in Congress, but the notion that Democrats who are in the minority in the House, the Senate, don't have the White House are somehow responsible for your inability to get things done is itself a fantasy. And what's amazing to me is that the party that for 8 years adopted the policy, obstruction today, obstruction tomorrow, obstruction forever, as long as Barack Obama was president of the United States of America, now wants to lecture us about governmental etiquette. We'll decide on our own, based on representing our constituents, what the rules of engagement should be. We're not taking advice on etiquette in doing our duty from the other side of the aisle. That's absurd. Now, there's a difference between optimism and fantasy. Optimism is based on the notion of the power of American exceptionalism. We can all embrace that, Democrats and Republicans. Fantasy is based on alternate facts. And what we're trying to figure out is whether this projection of 3% growth, $2 trillion increase in revenue projected over a 10-year period, is that just optimistic based on our belief in American exceptionalism, or as the president said, I'm the only one who can fix it? Or is it just alternate facts? And maybe I can start with Dr. Diamond. You testified that we should implement policies that encourage work. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you also said that tax reform should include limiting expenditures as part of an approach to encourage work. True?
Correct. Well, not for work, just to limit expenditures through the tax system.
Okay, and one of the largest expenditures through the tax system would be the mortgage interest deduction, is that right?
Correct, and it should definitely be reformed.
It should be reformed. Do you think it should be eliminated?
I wouldn't argue for elimination of it. I would argue that the home mortgage interest deduction doesn't do what it's stated to be supposed to do, which is supposed to encourage low-income people to be able to buy houses. But unfortunately, low-income people don't itemize their taxes and they have relatively low rates. So really all it does is encourage high-income people to overconsume housing. And so if we went to a system that actually encouraged low-income people to be able to afford houses, I would support that. And so I think it needs to be reformed, not eliminated.
Okay, so we have to substantially reform the mortgage interest tax deduction, widely viewed as helping middle-class Americans achieve the dream of home ownership. Would you also suggest that one of the policies we should adopt are tax cuts for the wealthy and the well-off, millionaires, billionaires, people who are at the highest income bracket in this country?
I wouldn't state it that way, and I would actually say, in some sense, we could actually raise taxes on them. But I mean, that you're talking about a comprehensive reform that needs to be, you know, the final effect is going to depend on how you structure the reform. So if we go to full expensing, could we raise the rate on capital gains and dividends and not reduce the corporate rate as much? Absolutely. Well, those are all trade-offs. I mean,
setting aside the corporate rate, because I think there's widespread agreement amongst many of us that, you know, 33% is too high. The Obama administration proposed going to 28. Trump says 15. You know, maybe there's some common ground that can be found there. But let's talk about the tax rate, because you support raising or lowering the top tax rate on millionaires and billionaires. Isn't that right? I mean, I can restate it. 39.6% is the rate. You support lowering that. True?
I say we should minimize it. I don't think I gave a number as to how low it should be. That's going to depend on how much we want to spend and trying to raise revenues that fund our expenditures.
Now, we experienced approximately 4% growth during the 1990s. Is that right?
4% growth in the 1990s? I don't believe so.
Were there periods of time where we experienced substantial growth during the 1990s, which in part led to eliminating the deficit?
Post 1995, we experienced some innovation-driven growth in the 1990s as this new web technology and other things. The computer, which could, you know, allowed secretaries to have typings that were already done. They didn't have to retype everything, made people more productive. There were a lot of productivity increases in the middle and late 1990s that increased growth that have seemingly disappeared since, say, 2004.
I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Maybe it's from the vantage point of the district I represent, but representing a district with Apple, Google, and having large presence Intel, Facebook, I'm less concerned about our country's long-term innovation and economic growth, and more concerned about issues of income inequality and income disparity, and who will gain and benefit from the economic growth, whether it'll just be entrepreneurs in certain parts of this country, or whether that growth will be distributed. And given that, I wanted to ask about a proposal which in the past has enjoyed bipartisan appeal. It was actually a Milton Friedman idea, which is the Earned Income Tax Credit. At a time where the investor class and capital already has an extraordinary return, it would seem to me that our tax policy should be more geared towards helping working families and helping folks who have had wages stagnate. And I'd be curious to all three economists' view of expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit, the benefit that would provide to working families, and the benefit it would provide to the labor market, given it would provide a subsidy, a supplement for people to enter the workforce, and also some subsidy to the employer to increase recruitment. And all the studies I've shown suggest that actually helps employment. Maybe we could start with Dr. Furman, and I'd love to have the other two economists weigh in as well.
I agree. I would support an increase in the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's a pro-work safety net provision, and I think it's generally productive. It does create certain issues, but overall I support it. In fact, in my discussion of reducing tax expenditures, I think the tax expenditures we should not eliminate would be ones that incentivize people to work, such as the EITC, or that incentivize a larger stock of capital to make workers more productive.
My next question is just more philosophical, and it's this open question about what is technology going to do for the future of work, and what is your view? I mean, I think there's this overwrought sense of, okay, people are just not going to have jobs, which in the past, John Maynard Keynes had written this whole article how we were all going to work 15-hour work weeks. It hasn't turned out to be true. On the other hand, there is going to be a displacement effect, and I wonder what your thoughts are on how we should prepare for this transition. Maybe Dr. Furman and the others, or go ahead.
I'll just say our profession earned the name the dismal science because we've often made wrong predictions on this front. And so I would say that, yes, it's going to change the face of work. I think other jobs will crop up, just like, the typewriter, moving from the typewriter to the computer didn't put everybody out of work. I don't think the robots are going to put us all out of work either.
Gentleman yields back his 7 seconds. Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Sanford.
Thanks, Chairwoman. I'd say to my colleague from California, I saw a freaky movie over the weekend entitled Her, and it's about this guy that falls in love with his operating system. But the happy ending for all of us is at the end of the day, it doesn't work out, and he goes back to human form. Not every human is replaced on that front. In deference to my chairwoman, I made it very clear in my last, the last hearing we held, that I don't believe that 3% growth is realistic at this particular 10-year juncture, as much as I'd like to see it. But I think in deference to my chairwoman, I'm going to leave that subject alone for the moment. And I'm going to skip on to 3 points of economic growth that I do think are important. One is infrastructure. Would all of you agree, going back to the consensus that my colleague found, that infrastructure ought to be paid for, or do you say, no, it's dynamic and it doesn't need to be paid for? Where are each of you on that? Just, again, simple, quick, paid for or no?
Pay for it. Yeah, I think it's overstated the productivity effects.
Okay.
I think it's better to pay for it, and then we would end up with higher growth, and it would bring our deficit down.
So, paid for or no?
Pay for it, and let the growth lower the deficit.
In a world with 77% debt to GDP ratio, it should be paid for.
Okay. And I think that point is underscored by the fact that if you look at Japan, which went on a tremendous infrastructure spending binge, if you want to call it that, in an effort to reboot their economy, ultimately they end up with a lot of debt, but not that much in the way of economic growth. And I do think that demographics are a driver here. I appreciate, Mr. Diamond, sobriety by which you approach the debt and the deficit issue. I don't think that it's emphasized enough in Washington, either from an administration standpoint or a congressional standpoint. I think you really hit hard how important that is and how it will ultimately be a driver with regard to economic growth in our country as well as budgetary impact. But I want to talk about one part of economic growth that really has been, I think, diminished of late. And that's David Ricardo's notion of competitive advantage and the need, in fact, to trade with other parts of the world. We grow great moss and mosquitoes on the coast of South Carolina. We don't grow wheat that well. In Kansas, they grow wheat well. It's just natural to that area. And there are other areas that have competitive advantage with regard to certain products. I think it has been sort of underscored here lately, and so when you begin to look at Buy American or Davis-Bacon or go down a long list of things that begin to restrict one's ability to trade freely, or even the way in which some people are saying, well, it's not that advantageous altogether, the notion of free trade. If you look at the port in Charleston and South Carolina have been transformed as a result of open commerce and open investment and free trade. Would, in the 1 minute and 50 seconds I've got left, if you all would just touch each lightly on how important you believe free trade is to economic growth and its budgetary impacts going forward.
I also think it's critical. Most of the consumption growth in the world will occur outside of the U.S., and so if we want to sell to the most number of consumers, we're going to need to sell around the world.
I now recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your testimony, very thoughtful. I wanted to go back to the immigration reform.
Not only to consumers, but in lower wages, so I agree with you. So if we're able to reduce the business income tax rate to a much lower consumption tax, I'm switching gears, and I know Dr. Diamond, you've talked about this in your testimony. Would that be a pro-growth policy that could help grow the economy? I want to.
Yes, it would. I think it would grow the economy, and it's a policy that I've supported for several years.
I just want your other.
What he said.
So if I'm looking at a path of fiscal unsustainability, which I keep saying back home, and we know that we have to cut taxes to avoid companies from leaving. That's one thing, and I also assume that if we cut taxes, we'll grow the economy at some rate. Would you agree or disagree, any of you?
I would argue that we need to lower the rate and maybe we move to expensing, but we will need to offset some of that revenue loss by taking away other preferences. Some of the studies I've written have said the preferences you don't want to take away are the investment related preferences.
I want to get to the expense side, though. We're on the revenue side now. I think I'm trying to see that we're all agreeing, Republicans, Democrats are all agreeing. We got to cut rates, we got to reduce our unsustainable path, and we got to look at what we're spending. Now, whether you call it tax preferences or actual spending, it's the same thing. It's the other side of the aisle. Would you agree?
I completely agree, and as I noted in my testimony, spending is projected to increase from 20.7% of GDP to 29.3%. That's a staggering increase.
Well, I guess I'm out of time. I apologize. I yield back.
No, your time has expired. Good questions. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Carvajal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Black and Ranking Member Yarmouth. Dr. Holtz, after President Trump's budget was released, you indicated that 3% growth was at the outer bound of what was feasible. And you, Dr. Furman, indicated that the chances of achieving 3% growth was about 1 in 25. Obviously, 3% growth would be nice if we could get it. And to all the witnesses, there has been a lot of discussion of the merits of tax cuts. Many on the other side think that the top marginal tax rate is the most powerful force in the universe, or at least in the economy. That seems to me a bit overstating the case. After all, we saw a relatively strong economic growth in the 1980s after President Reagan cut taxes on the wealthy. We similarly saw strong economic growth in the 1990s after President Clinton raised taxes on the wealthy. It seems pretty clear that other factors are at work here and that tax rates are not the primary factor driving growth. Do you all agree? Dr. Diamond?
I think tax rates are important, but as Dr. Holtz-Egan mentioned, I also think there's another side of the tax code that we need to look at. Overall, I mean, taxes are not the only factor, and you mentioned that. I mean, obviously there are a lot of factors, regulation, deficits, and the negative effects of deficits that will also affect growth. So they're a piece of the puzzle, but not the puzzle.
Thank you. Chairwoman Black, I yield back.
Wow, thank you. We've got a number of folks that are yielding back today. You're all going to get stars. I now recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Lewis, for 5 minutes.
I'd like to thank the chair and the gentleman for coming to testify today. You're right. Taxes aren't the only thing that matter. We seem to be focused a lot on tax expenditures and not actual budget expenditures. Last year we had record revenues, $3.26 trillion, and yet $600 billion deficits. So when we talk about what causes a deficit or the debt, we need to make certain we keep our eye on the prize, and it certainly hasn't been a lack of tax revenue. It's been increasing expenditures, which crowd out the capital markets, the same as deficits. In fact, one could argue it's not the deficit that crowds out the capital markets, it's actually the expenditure, especially inefficient ones. But be that as it may, rarely do I get a chance to quiz 3 economists, so I'm going to take the opportunity, probably all 5 minutes. Let me ask each of you, first of all, what the fundamental goal is when you're formulating, whether it's tax policy or whether you're serving on the budget committee for that matter. Is the goal of good policy economic growth or a balanced budget? Let's start with you, Dr. Egan.
Economic growth.
Dr. Furman?
Economic growth that's shared.
I would say the economic growth, but an unbalanced budget is going to lead to lower economic growth. So in a sense, it's the same question.
There is.
Let's move to income inequality, because I'm fascinated by this topic. If we've got a rising economic growth and every quintile is going up, but we've got Jeff Bezos or we've got Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, and they go up a whole lot, my goodness, that's a rise in income inequality. Juxtapose that with the Great Depression. Everybody's income fell, but there's a bottom to that. So income inequality actually shrinks during a downturn. Why are we so focused on income inequality? And show me where changes in the marginal tax rates have any effect at all on income inequality that's primarily an educational, socioeconomic issue. Let's start with Dr. Diamond there quickly.
Well, we saw this during the Great Recession. Inequality actually reduced a little bit as the rich were hit. I mean, so it's an important factor. I mean, I think it's important to be concerned about how everyone's doing. I don't think it's an overriding factor, or let me say, I don't think we should necessarily respond.
Can taxes make a difference?
Raising marginal tax rates. Taxes can make a small difference, but they're not going to solve a problem that's caused by something other than taxes.
Unfortunately, my time is up. I could go on for another 10, 15 minutes if you'd like, but I think my
Your time has expired, the gentleman from Minnesota. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
I'd be delighted for the gentleman to keep going because I'm trying to, with my dear friend, understand his line of reasoning. But let me refer ourselves, gentlemen and ladies, to the tale of two cities. That's why we're concerned about income inequality. I can't imagine that we would sit here and talk about not being concerned whether Americans are dragging themselves through the streets with no jobs and maybe nothing to eat, since nutrition and lack thereof is one of the high elements of this country, whether or not children can be educated and young people can get a college education. That's income inequality. And this budget, from my perspective, as we indicated before, let me not try to paint the rosy scenario program. I don't know if anyone knows her, but she's missing in action today. I would clearly say that this is a dead-on-arrival budget. And I don't know why we're so fearful of going back and comparing Reagan and Clinton in the years where under Reagan we had a $1.4 trillion deficit. Clinton had a $63 billion surplus. Reagan had a 3.64 growth. Clinton 3.82, created 22 million jobs. Monthly, Clinton created 242,000 jobs, with 166 by President Reagan, both of whom I certainly respect as presidents because they handled themselves as presidents. President Obama was a good custodian of the work that Bill Clinton had done. But here we are today traveling down a path that makes absolutely no sense. So let me just quickly try to raise some points on the basis of history. September 25th, 2008, I recall I was here. I was here in 2007, Dr. Furman. That was a debacle when Lehman Brothers was not bailed out while others were. That was when we went home to Americans and they could not believe it, and they said to us, don't bail anyone out, don't do anything. They were in shock, but we were on the verge of collapse, and Wall Street did take a deep dive. The resilience of this nation and the leadership of Democrats brought us to the fact that we are still standing. So my question is, if you look at the budget overall, I want you to answer two questions. One, and I'm going to ask the other panelists, the value of the CBO analysis that we've always done. Is it important that Congress looks at an independent arbiter to deal with numbers? CBO has done that. Secondarily, with baby boomers, of which none of us are in, we're all millenniums at this point, are getting older. We're not infusing the workforce. We have an immigration policy that takes away hardworking immigrants, young people who want to be here, who are not dangerous. And so we need a workforce. With this type of budget, does that suggest 3% growth? Does that say that we have a vision of growth? And the other part of it is it not valuable that government invest in its people? The surplus, I'm trying to get the right name, I remember I voted for it, the bailout, but the proposal that we had under President Obama that we all voted for did a lot to energize the economy. My question to you, Dr. Furman, are those, based on the backdrop of the Clinton-Reagan analysis, the custodial work that Obama did, you were in administration, and the vision of this budget. Dr. Diamond, in my last seconds here, let me add a little caveat. We've got a lot of people incarcerated. We've been trying to pull back on mass incarceration, and it's been bipartisan, the Cook brothers and others. Does that not undermine the workforce? And are my premises not right about the economy is energized by people working, and if you have thousands completely, constantly locked up, does that not have an impact as well?
I definitely think incarceration has a negative impact on people and the economy. I think the CBO is important, and we need to continue to rely on them. And I think the budget goes in, at least, I don't agree with the budget in total, but my point in my testimony is we're spending too much money. We're projected to spend too much money. At some point, we're going to have to slow the growth of spending.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Just want to go down the line and ask for just a brief comments on the relationship between growth and growth productivity. Are the curves similar? As you get more growth, you naturally get more productivity. Would you all agree to that?
I guess I would make a distinction between leveling up, so an increase in GDP that's just like a one-time change in the level, which may come from some policies, versus a small change in a growth rate which endures over time and which builds on itself so that you get growth on top of growth. I think that's more important in a long-run sense than just a level-up approach.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Lujan Grisham, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thanks to the committee members. I want to do two things because certainly interested in a return on any investment and growing the economy, and I'm sure this committee gets tired of me reminding them, but I'm always happy to do that for a new group, that New Mexico has the highest unemployment in the country, and we're not now the worst economy in the country, but by no means are we in a position where we're seeing real or any, quite frankly, economic growth. And the strategy that we've taken in New Mexico, particularly over the last 8 years, but even before then, under both Democratic and now Republican leadership, is to invest in huge tax breaks at the top, 1%, and corporate tax breaks, which has left the state without any sufficient or viable resources, and the end result has been zero economic growth. No trickle-down investments, no effort that's given us any aspect of a strategy. So for me, living that in my current state and situation, I don't see how these strategies are going to work at a national level. And if we're looking for something where there's bipartisan agreement on clear economic growth, I'm interested in your opinions about comprehensive immigration reform, which particularly in a state like mine provides an immediate return into the pocketbooks of every New Mexican, as well as stabilizing and moving growth for a variety of industries, not just ag and for us healthcare and long-term care, but entrepreneurship, in fact, which we lead in the nation, and I need to be careful because I haven't checked that data at least in an hour. So it changes that quickly, but we've been one of the leading states in entrepreneurism, particularly among minority women in the state. So I'd be interested in the panel's reaction on, I'm living in a state that's seen no benefit from any of the strategies that continue to be presented, not only here today, but in previous budget hearings. But in addition, what you think about economic growth under comprehensive immigration reform. Anyone, all of you.
I agree that immigration reform is an important pro-growth policy.
So, and not that I'm disagreeing that you shouldn't have a variety of strategies. And in fact, in our economy, I find it difficult to weigh in and say that that one set of policies by one policymaker, whether that's the legislative body or the governor or local elected policymakers. The reality is, in New Mexico, they didn't create the 2008 recession. They didn't ask to have oil and gas commodity prices and related ag commodity prices drop. They certainly didn't call Congress and say we ought to do a sequester. We're a defense industry state. So it's all those things combined certainly tell you that you need to have a diversified economy with several strategies that allow you to more meaningfully react to economic changes. However, in addition to all of those factors, you know, as I said, we're a state that also provided massive tax cuts in effort to create job growth. It's created zero job growth, and again, we're not only, as I described earlier in this hearing, having such economic woes, but in fact, we're the only state in the nation that's losing population, which means we have a brain drain, we don't have any young people, and we don't have a qualified workforce. So even if these trickle-down strategies work, and they don't, in my opinion, there isn't anybody to trickle down to, because we've lost the opportunity to do job creation and train a qualified workforce. And Mr. Chairman, I didn't have it when I started, but I would love to have unanimous consent to enter the article into the record from our main newsprint media source that talks about the problems with the tax cuts and tax cut policy in our state.
Without objection, that will be included in the record.
Thank you very much. I really don't have any further questions unless
And
maybe
it's good
one.
news as the gentlelady's time has expired.
Oh, man, I was just getting started. I changed my mind, Mr. Chairman.
As soon as Mr. Yarmouth recognizes round two here, we'll come right
Done.
back. But
thank you very much to the
we're
panel.
standing between you and our resident in-house economist, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Brad.
Oh, thank you very much. All right, you all on this panel are in jeopardy of failing Econ 101 a bit here. When consumers, individuals want to maximize utility, we don't talk about growing the economy, right? And I've noted the language coming out here is for our economy. So of course, immigration, if you import another worker, will increase the size of your economy. But to show the fatal flaw in the logic coming out on this immigration issue, it's fairly easy. Let's just import the whole world, right? Let's just have 7 billion people move to the United States of America, right? So that will be the biggest economy you've ever seen. Right? It'll increase our GDP by 400% or whatever, right? Global, and not one person will be better off, right? So Econ 101 says, what do people care about? They care about GDP per capita after transfers and taxes, right? That's how you maximize utility. None of you, I don't think you can show me any papers that show, right? The average folks coming across the border from Mexico, South America, 10th grade education, all children of God, right? No issue there. We're just talking economics. They'll come in, they'll make 20 grand. If you got 2 kids in education, that's 26 grand. You're upside down. And we're only 100 trillion light on unfunded liabilities right now and 20 trillion light on debt, right? Because we've screwed up the logic and haven't paid any attention to productivity growth. So we are stuck in a bind, and so you're offering us the little ray of hope you can. Well, in the short run, right, there's a pig stuck in a python called the demographic thing. Gee, I wish we would have known that about that 10 years ago. Well, we did. It's just total political failure on all fronts, right? To plan for the Medicare system and Social Security are insolvent in 2034. It's upside down. And so you're saying bring in folks in order to solve a temporary problem, which it will, right? You might get a little bit more tax revenue short run, you grow the economy, but I don't know where to start on that one. If you can show me any papers that show immigration helps increase productivity and GDP per capita after taxes and transfers, I'm wide open to that. Second, my colleague, Mr. Jeffries over there, talked about, well, we had $1.4 trillion deficits coming out of the Bush years. And so, you know, the Obama economy, we had to fix that. Again, just a colossal error in Econ 101. What caused the financial crisis? And there's no debate. Everyone agrees the financial crisis started in the housing sector. Do you know any private sector bank that would give liar loans and no income loans for mortgages? No. Only the federal government is capable of that genius move, right? And so just go look up Fannie and Freddie and Mr. Johnson and that empire he set up across the country. And you'll find out why we had $1.4 trillion deficits. Now let me get to the whole point here on productivity. On the other side of the aisle, they have all sorts of immigration, pre-K, education, etc. No literature, nothing's been presented that will increase GDP growth, right, per capita, etc. Right? I was in education for 20 years. So it sounds great. Another thousand, how much do you need, right? How many more thousands? We spend 14 grand per kid right now per year. And I teach freshman economics, and the kids don't know what a business is after 13 years in K-12. They don't know what a price is. They don't know what a cost is. They don't know what a profit is. Great. And in higher ed, it's widely taught that business on the supply side is morally corrupt, right? K-12 is neutral. Higher ed is not neutral, right? So gee whiz, I wonder why productivity growth isn't great when we teach people that the supply side is a pejorative, nasty word. So demand curve, supply curve, right? Demand curves your consumers, supply curves all business. And the supply curve is the supply side of the economy is bad? Really? Everybody that produces goods and services is bad? So what we don't hear from the other side, we've had demand side stuff forever, right? Bailouts and non-ending demand stuff. There's no productivity growth, right? It's flatter than a pancake. Capital investment's flatter than a pancake. And so I'm dying to hear something from the other side that will enhance productivity growth. And they did have, President Obama, a majority in the House, Senate, and whatever. So if you want to do productivity enhancements, why didn't they do it? So I just see a collapsing argument on the other side. I don't see anything they've proposed over 8 years that enhances productivity growth. And on the contrary, they're saying supply side incentives are bad, right? It's trickle down or some pejorative term like that. And so I've already blown through my time. But you all did hit pay dirt. You all said productivity is the whole story, right? And so if you can help me show, if you can present this panel and both sides with some economic papers on how immigration will enhance GDP growth per capita after taxes and transfers, I'd love to see that. If you can give me any arguments on pre-K education or enhancements in K-12 or higher ed that will enhance GDP growth significantly in any range, I'm wide open to seeing that. If they do, I'm all on board, right? And so thank you very much for being here today, and appreciate it.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. Thank you for your forbearance.
I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to pick up where my colleague left off. It is true, I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer, and so I rely on you all, and you come together with a lot of good maxims that I try to apply. One of those maxims is, and Dr. Furman used it in his opening statement, infrastructure spending is good for GDP, but it's not good in the same way to build a sidewalk out in front of my house as it is to build a rail line that runs coast to coast. And so you supply me with the maxims, but then the conversation tends to end there. For example, immigration. No, do I need folks to pick carrots in South Georgia? Absolutely do. Am I running out of families who are having 3.5 kids and raising them all to pick carrots? I absolutely am. But I also need more nuclear physicists and more entrepreneurs on and on. So let me start with you, Dr. Holtz-Eakin. You mentioned that 35 years used to be the time period for doubling our standard of living. Now that's almost doubled. Is your analysis that is systemic to the American economy, or that is because we are a participant in the world economy? Yeah. Dr. Diamond?
I agree. There's a lot we could do outside of spending additional dollars that would make us more productive. I agree with trying to reach kids sooner, especially low-income kids, and I think a lot of that's on a state-level issue, just more of reprioritizing where we want to spend the money each year more so than spending more money.
I would ask you all to continue that kind of intellectual investment. Before Mr. Grothman walked in, Mr. Yarmouth and I were prepared to stage a coup here. We might disagree on how much to spend on infrastructure, but spending those dollars in a way that move the needle in the largest fashion, we would come to some sort of agreement on. We might disagree about how much to spend on education, but spending those dollars in a way that maximize the utility would be something we would agree on. And my final question is this. irrespective of growth rates and president's budgets. President Obama sent me 8 budgets that never balanced, but invested a great deal in the American economy. President Trump has sent me a budget that is purported to balance, reduces a great deal of spending in the American economy. From an economic perspective, is it obvious what grows GDP going out into the future? Budgets that balance or budgets that don't? Or is the question not that simple? Mr. Diamond?
You know, I think that what's important in the latest budget isn't so much, and we focus a lot on the 3%, but we're actually reducing the growth rate in spending for the, we've proposed to reduce the growth rate in spending for the first time in I can't remember when, so that's at least one good thing.
I thank you all for your many, many years of service. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
First of all, thanks for keeping things going so I got a chance to answer questions. I just don't want to let that just point out that I think the amount spent per pupil in our schools and the number of people going to college, the amount we spend on college, I'm sure the amount per person or per pupil in K-12 has gone up well in excess of the rate of inflation in the last 50 years. I personally don't feel that spending still more money there is the key to success. I think maybe how they spend it is relevant. I think the same thing is true of a college education. At least right now, I think we have maybe people graduating from college that can't get jobs in their field, whereas if they would have stuck in tech school or been trained by their businesses, they'd be much better off. So I'm not sure, more government spending on education is the answer. But I want to get back to why our economy is not growing more, and I do happen to represent the district with more manufacturing jobs than any other district in the country. And as I tour my district, be it manufacturing or be it other things, the number one thing that seems to be holding my businesses back is they can't find people to work. Okay, they really have a hard time finding people to work out there. And I'm trying to think what we can do to find more people to fill those jobs so our economy can grow. Now, right here I noticed that disability, people on disability has grown over the last 14 years by about 60%. And that's despite the fact that I think over time, our farms, certainly our manufacturers have gotten safer and safer. So normally common sense would say, given how much safer things are going, you'd figure the number of people on SSDI is dropping. I realize the population is getting a little older. But when I look at this chart, I see, if we had the same percentage of people on disability overall that we did 14 years ago, maybe we'd have another 2.5–3 million people going to work, and the economic figures should be going up all the quicker. Does anybody care to comment as to whether they feel that, if we're a little bit more careful about who we're putting on disability, and I realize there are people who are generally disabled and need the help, I don't have a problem there, but if we're a little bit more careful, maybe we'd be able to jumpstart the economy as these people would fill all the jobs out there that are wanting. Another question. When I talk to my employers, particularly on the lower end of the wage scale, they find people are not wanting raises, don't want to work full time because it digs into their benefits, be it affects their low-income housing, their health insurance benefits, their food share. I know the number of people on food share has gone up from 17 million in 2001 to 43 million last year, which is kind of dramatic. We have another program, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which was apparently designed by people who don't want anybody making more than 19 grand a year, because that's another benefit you lose. To what degree do you think the economy is stagnating because of what I am told by my employers, that people are intentionally not making as much as they can to get the government benefits? Want to take a shot at it, Dr. Diamond?
I think it's a legitimate issue. I think we've seen with unemployment compensation, with Obamacare, with other spending programs, you can put an implicit tax on work, and that can discourage people from working. And
right, you have 43 million people on food share. Now, some people are always going to be on food share, but 43 million? I mean, that's a lot of people. When you shoot up from 17 million 15 years ago to 43 million now, I mean, you wonder how many of those people would work harder if we didn't take away their benefits if they did work harder.
I think that's a reasonable concern. We need to structure our policies so that we are as pro-work as possible.
Thank Thank you much. Thank you for hanging around. And I had 2 committees, but we'll be forever grateful that you waited for me.
Thank you, gentlemen, for spending the morning with us. Dr. Holtz-Eakin and Dr. Furman, Dr. Diamond, thank you very much for your testimony. Please be advised that members may submit questions in writing for you, and those answers will be placed in the record as well. Any member who wishes to submit questions or any extraneous material may have 7 days to do so. With that, the committee stands adjourned.